The sound of scissors clicked sharply in the silent room. Officer Bradley leaned in, his voice low and hard. "Here, this tangled hair is just trash, and I decide when it's gone." Amara sat trembling, clutching her carefully braided hair, whispering, "Please, my mom braided it for me." Bradley let out a mocking laugh. "That rotten culture has no place on this land." Every word hit like a blade, turning the room into an invisible execution ground. The temporary holding room was already harsh, its 4 gray-washed walls coated in a fog of cold that drained the last traces of warmth from the air. Overhead, a flickering old neon bulb cast pale white light down onto the cracked tile floor, forming splotchy reflections that made the ground feel like it was slowly being eaten away. In the center of the room, on a coarse wooden chair, Amara sat curled up, legs tight together, thin shoulders trembling beneath the direct light hitting her face. Her long braided hair hung like a black curtain, each plait carefully woven by her mother's hands during rare peaceful evenings, now feeling like a burden she was afraid to carry. Amara's eyes darted around, shifting from the fractured tiles below to the dim ceiling above, where the scattered beams of light failed to chase away the growing loneliness. She sat there, taking short breaths, chest rising and falling in tension, waiting for something she didn't dare to name. The thick steel door screeched without warning, its hinges groaning like a threat. The sudden sound made Amara's heart clench, sweat gathering in her palms until she had to rub them on her knees just to feel real. Each step of hard-soled shoes landed with crisp, deliberate rhythm, pounding against the worn floor like blows against her young mind. As the door opened, the tall figure of Officer Bradley filled the frame, blocking out the light from the hallway until the room sank once more into its cold shadow, lit only by the weak glow above. She didn't enter immediately, instead, standing still, her eyes scanning Amara from head to toe as if appraising a disappointed object. Bradley tilted her head slightly, cold eyes openly filled with disdain. Her voice cut through the air, high-pitched but sharp as steel. "Around here, we don't let wild hair like that stay." The words echoed off the 4 walls, shattering into thousands of ripples that pierced Amara's ears, making her whole body tremble. Her arms instinctively wrapped around her hair, a reflex to shield the last remaining piece of pride she had. Bradley's words weren't just an order. They were an act of erasure, a denial of the culture woven into every braid on Amara's head. The air in the room thickened so heavy that even breathing became a struggle. The neon light hissed like rain falling into a bottomless pit, stretching the silence into something unbearable. Shadow and light collided, casting Bradley's towering silhouette across the floor, her shadow swallowing Amara and making her feel smaller than ever. Inside, the girl questions screamed. Why was her hair called wild? Why did anyone have the right to strip away this tiny source of pride? Why did a child have to sit here in this room enduring humiliation she did not deserve? But the questions never left her throat, breaking apart into tears that threatened to fall. Amara remained silent. That silence was not submission, but another form of resistance, fragile yet unyielding. She gripped her hair tightly, knuckles pale from the pressure fingernails digging into her skin with a sting that helped her focus. The pain was a reminder that this body was still hers, that not everything had been taken. In her mind, an image of her mother appeared, those skillful hands gently braiding her daughter's hair, each strand woven with a story, a memory, a cultural mark. That hair was not just decoration. It was a piece of dignity, of identity. And now the one thing left was in the sights of someone who used power to turn it into a tool for humiliation. Bradley stepped closer, her shoes landing with a steady thud on the floor. She stopped right in front of Amara, leaning down, her eyes glinting with a twisted pleasure at the girl's trembling frame. A smirk curled at the corner of her lips, not with any trace of kindness, but with the sick delight of someone who found joy in watching fear take hold. Amara instinctively looked up, their eyes met, then she immediately dropped her gaze, heart pounding out of rhythm. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were numb. numb, her lips dry, and any sound was crushed inside her chest. The neon light above cast soft shadows, stretching long and thin, highlighting the lines on Amara's forehead where sweat had begun to form. The silence dragged on heavy as a rope tightening around her neck. Only Amara's quickened breath mixed with the sound of Bradley's shoes filled the air background noise to a scene that would chill anyone who witnessed it. In that moment, Bradley was no longer just a police officer, but a living symbol of oppression, of inhuman power. Amara sat there small and still, but deep in her tear-filled eyes was the faint glow of something that refused to be crushed. It was memory, her mother's love, a fragile belief that this cruelty would one day be exposed. She held her hair tightly, arms folded close as if embracing her entire childhood, her entire identity. Everything shrank down, folded into itself inside that cold room, waiting for the storm that was about to strike. The metal door shut behind Bradley, the click of the lock ringing out like a fateful bell. The room now held only two people, an oppressor and a child turned victim. No way out, no other gaze to plead for help. The pale neon light kept falling steady and merciless. Time seemed to stop, each second dragging like an entire century. In that moment, Amara understood that her peace had shattered, and her innocent childhood had just been strangled by the cruel, cold words of someone who called herself the law. Amara sat still, her eyes fixed on the gray tiled floor, where the deep cracks etched across it looked like scars carved into a wounded soul. All that remained in her was the effort not to cry out loud, not to let the other see her break. And it was that very silence, the stubborn grip on the last shred of dignity, that turned the cold room into a quiet battlefield where a frail child faced ruthless power. And through that tense silence, she sent a message: she had not been completely conquered. A sharp clicking sound echoed dryly as Officer Bradley held a pair of gleaming steel scissors, snapping the blades together just enough to let the metal clash ring through the tight space. In the cramped interrogation room, the sound sliced through the already heavy air, loud and shrill, like metal tearing through fabric. On the moldy old wooden table, the cold white light from the neon bulb struck the blades, causing a blinding flash to reflect onto the wall like an executioner's knife preparing for the kill. Bradley spun the scissors casually in her hand as if toying with some harmless object, but beneath that casual act was a clear intent to humiliate. She leaned down close to Amara, a bitter smile tugging at her lips, and said with slow, precise cruelty, "Pretty, isn't it? But that kind of pretty doesn't fit the rules around here." Amara flinched at the words, her eyes wide with panic. Her lips trembled, parting and closing again as if trying to form a plea, but her throat locked up. She shook her head gently, an instinctive gesture, and her small hands quickly clutched her braids where her mother's warmth still lingered from peaceful days now gone. Her voice broke out weakly, no more than a breath from deep within her chest, choked with emotion. "Please don't. My mom braided it for me." The words were so soft they seemed likely to disappear into the thick air, yet they carried undeniable weight. The cry of a child's heart pushed to the edge. In Amara's tearful eyes, a fragile light flickered, a mix of fear and the pain of having to speak those words to defend a memory woven into her hair. Bradley narrowed her eyes, tilting her head slightly as a half-smile curled at the corner of her mouth, a smile with no trace of sympathy. She hissed out the next words, sharp as poison. "This backward culture isn't respected in this country." The tone was more than denial. It was a deep, invisible cut at the roots of Amara's pride. Each word hit with precision, burrowing into her mind, trying to crush the cultural meaning held within her hair, turning it into a joke, a reason for shame. The insult wasn't aimed at Amara alone, it trampled on an entire community, a culture for whom braided hair was sacred. In that moment, Bradley's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. She had succeeded in planting fear and a sense of violation in a child's heart. The air in the room grew heavier by the second. The neon bulb kept crackling, casting its cold, bluish-white light onto Amara's young face, where tears shimmered like crystals on the edge of falling. Her short, shallow breaths blended with the metallic snap of the scissors as Bradley flicked them harder, making the sound even more jarring. Slowly, she lifted the scissors, held them at Amara's eye level, then brought them down near the trembling strands of hair. The light bounced off the steel blades, reflecting onto Amara's scalp like a blade pressed against skin, ready to erase everything with a single cut. Amara trembled uncontrollably, her breathing broke in her small hands trying to shield her hair, but shaken so badly she could not fully cover it. A rush of memories filled her mind, afternoons where her mother sat patiently by the window, braiding her hair while sharing stories of family and tradition. Each braid was not just hair, but a thread connecting her to her roots, to pride in her skin, her culture. And now all of that was under threat by the figure in front of her, someone holding power but wielding it to crush a child. Bradley tilted her head, her eyes scanning Amara's face before landing on the tear-filled ones. A smirk crept across her lips and her voice came slow and deliberate, each word striking like a hammer. Every little girl needs to learn obedience. You'll learn through this hair. The words sounded like a final sentence, leaving no room for pleading. Amara's hair, the thing she cherished most, had become the sacrifice in Bradley's cruel game. The room felt breathless, holding still as the only sound was the soft rustle of Amara's hands moving in a desperate attempt to hold on to her hair. The cold gleam of the scissors reflected in her teary eyes, heightening her panic. She bit her lip, drawing blood, but kept her gaze locked on the scissors as if they were the most dangerous enemy she had ever faced. She was shaken, but in her eyes a faint light of resistance began to flicker, a final stand to protect her dignity. Bradley noticed and seemed even more amused. She leaned in, lowered her voice, and whispered into Amara's ear with a rough, mocking tone. "Don't try to act brave, little girl. Even this hair doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me, to the law I control." Each word dropped like a final cut, shredding the last threads of Amara's fragile hope. She closed her eyes, tears spilling freely, but still clung tightly to her hair, even knowing this defense was nothing more than a fragile arm raised against a raging storm. The space sank into a thick, heavy silence. The clicking of the scissors echoed like a countdown, marking the approach of something terrible. Amara sat there, shoulders trembling violently, but her eyes still held a faint hope for a miracle, that the door might swing open, that someone might come to stop it. But the door stayed shut, and the world outside seemed to have turned its back, leaving her alone to face the humiliation hanging just inches above her head. In that moment, the room was no longer an interrogation space. It became a cruel stage where power played its vicious game by turning a child into a target. And in the pale white light, surrounded by shallow breaths and the gleam of cold steel hovering close, Amara realized that every second to come would change her life forever. A sharp, slicing sound tore through the room like a blade cutting through the silence. The scissors sliced through the strands of hair, and the space shuddered before falling into a terrifying stillness. A long, smooth, black lock, once cherished with daily care and pride, spun briefly in the air before landing with a soft thud on the cold tile floor. It lay there, limp and alone, painting a tragic image so clear that anyone who saw it would be struck speechless. Pale light from the narrow window fell across the fallen strand, causing it to gleam for a moment before fading like a soul extinguished before anyone could reach out to save it. Amara trembled slightly, her body pulling inward as if drawn back by invisible pain. Her lips pressed tight until they bled, the metallic taste spreading across her tongue, but still she refused to cry out. Her shining eyes welled up, a tear spilling down her cheek and landing on her shirt, warm at first, then suddenly cold. She dared not make a sound, knowing deep down that any sob would be twisted into amusement by the person standing over her. Her silence was the last fragile shield she had left, a desperate effort to hold on to the dignity crumbling inside her. Bradley watched the child's reaction, eyes gleaming with a cruel thrill. She curled her lips into a thin smile, her voice thick with mockery and command. "Look at you now, you look more obedient." The words slammed down like a hammer, crushing what remained of Amara's pride. It was no ordinary remark. It was a sentence, a declaration that stripping someone of their dignity could turn them into something compliant. Bradley's smile revealed no trace of humanity. It was cold as steel, rigid as chains, showing that to her this act was not abuse but a lesson delivered as deserved. Shame surged through Amara's body, searing through her nerves like fire. She clutched the remaining braids, hands, shaking fingers, gripping each one tightly as if letting go would mean losing everything. But even that gesture couldn't hide the truth. Now, lying on the floor, the fallen strand stood as undeniable proof of the damage done. Silence no longer meant peace. It became a wordless wound carved deep into the heart of a child, leaving behind a scar no one could erase. The pale light from the narrow window brushed across Amara's face, casting fractured patterns of shadow and light, revealing two worlds inside her. One side was a fragile child, yearning to be loved and protected. The other a being forced into sacrifice under the weight of cruelty. The light gave no warmth, thin and cold, like the glances of those who had once turned away, pretending not to see. In that clash of worlds, Amara could only stay quiet, letting the sound of her breath speak for her resistance. Every passing second stretched like an entire century. The shame kept piling up, creeping into the deepest roots of her soul. Amara kept her head down, her hair covering her tear-reddened eyes, but the humiliation could not be hidden. The tears continued to fall, mixing with the blood at the corner of her mouth, spreading into a mark that would not fade. In her heart echoed the question, why would a police officer, someone meant to protect justice, become the one so willing to strip away the small pride of a child? Why was hair alone enough to become the excuse for humiliation? Bradley didn't care about those questions. She stood still, fingers casually turning the scissors, the blades catching the light, her eyes locked on the child like a predator studying wounded prey. She inhaled deeply, then gave a soft laugh, a smile full of arrogance. In Bradley's eyes, Amara was no longer a person, only a target for dominance. Every tear, every bite mark on Amara's lips became proof of her own success. Amara's pain was no longer just about loss. It had become a wound in the mind, driven deep like a rusty nail, leaving behind a scar that could not be pulled free. Every tear that fell was heavy as stone, stacking into a mountain on her small heart. She didn't scream, didn't curse, but her silence echoed like a roar in the void. A silence of pride, a silence of protest, a silence that made the room feel as heavy as stone. Outside, the sky was gray clouds thick overhead, and the light filtering through the narrow window was pale and faint. Dust floated in the beam, swirling like witnesses to the tragedy that had just taken place. Everything outside remained calm, people passing by as usual, but inside this room, the world of a child had collapsed. All of it reduced to a single window frame where the light could reveal shame but never offer hope. Amara sat motionless, hands still clutching her hair, shoulders rising and falling with each shaky breath. She bit her lip again, the taste of blood sharp in her mouth, but she had no strength left to cry out. She knew she had just lost a part of herself, not just strands of hair, but memories, heritage, the belief that childhood was meant to be protected, and all of it had been torn away with a single cut of the blade. In that moment, silence became a wound carved deep. No one saw blood, but it had been spilled inside. No one heard a scream, but it had echoed in her chest. That shame, that damage would follow Amara for the rest of her life like a scar that would never fade. And in the corner of the room, where the pale light still flickered, the fallen lock of hair lay there silently, bearing witness to the tragedy, just etched into the memory of an innocent child. The courthouse hallway was quiet in the late afternoon, with pale light from the window at the end casting a thin broken strip across the floor worn smooth by time. The walls, once painted white, had faded to a yellowish hue, with peeling spots revealing gray cement beneath, evoking a sense of dampness and cold. The air held the stale scent of old disinfectant, mixed with the smell of paper files and the rubbing of leather shoes, an unpleasant blend that seemed to wrap the entire entire building in discomfort. In the middle of the corridor, a few court employees moved quickly, their footsteps echoing off the narrow walls, repeating in a drawn-out rhythm that made the space feel like a vault of sound. It was in this atmosphere that a young staffer, new to the job, happened to pass by an interrogation room with the door left slightly ajar. He meant to walk past as usual, but a glance through the opening made him stop in his tracks. Through the narrow gap, his eyes caught a scene that made his blood run cold. In the harsh glow of the neon light, Amara knelt on the floor, arms wrapped around the lock of hair that had just been cut. Her face, tear-streaked, her expression frantic. Her hair, once carefully braided and tied to her mother's love, now lay severed, scattered across the cold tile floor. Opposite her stood Officer Bradley, tall and imposing, the scissors in her hand gleaming under the dim light, a symbol of merciless authority. In that moment, the young staffer felt his stomach twist, his heart pound erratically. Instinct screamed at him to intervene, to speak up, to stop whatever injustice was unfolding. But then, Bradley's eyes snapped toward the door and locked onto his, and every thought vanished like smoke. It was the look of someone holding absolute power, cold, sharp, and clear, a warning that even a single breath of resistance would come at a cost. That glance said everything. He had no right to interfere. His body froze, and an invisible current ran down his spine, sending a chill deep into his back. He stood there, breath caught in his chest, not daring to let even the smallest sound escape into the heavy silence. In that moment, he felt tiny and helpless, a bystander pulled into the merciless machinery of a power game he could never win. A voice exploded down the hall, loud as thunder. "Turn around. This is police business." Bradley didn't need to step out, didn't raise her voice beyond normal, but each word struck like a blade, bouncing off the walls and landing hard in the young staffer's ears. The sound rolled down the empty hallway, sharp and undeniable, causing others passing by to pause for just a moment before quickly walking on, pretending they had heard nothing. The young man stood frozen, throat tight, mouth open as if to speak, but no words came. Bradley's gaze still seemed to hang in the air in front of him, pushing him back step by step away from the door. Inside that room, Amara was trembling, clutching the lock of hair to her chest as if trying to reattach it to her head. She whispered, her small voice shaking "Mama." That fragile sound slipped through the crack in the door, so faint it could vanish in the soft breeze drifting through the hallway. Yet it thundered in the heart of the one who heard it. It was the voice of despair, a cry for help, reaching toward a place too far away, a plea that could choke anyone who still held on to a shred of humanity. The young staffer clenched his hands, palms soaked with sweat, his vision blurred, unsure whether from the light or the shame rising inside him. He wanted to run in to tell Bradley she had gone too far, but the closed door, like an invisible wall, along with that earlier threatening glance, locked every instinct in place. His steps retreated slowly, each one weighted like a stone, pressing down on his chest. He looked back one last time, saw Amara, curled in the harsh light, the severed hair nestled in her small arms. Then he turned away. His eyes dropped, avoiding every glance, even the truth he had just witnessed. He knew clearly he had just become an accomplice, not through action but through cowardly silence. That silence was no different from a quiet nod, a wordless permission that handed more power to the one abusing it. The hallway stretched long ahead, the pale light from the window at the end casting a thin streak across the floor. A soft breeze passed through the door crack, shifting the sheer curtain, which brushed gently against the wall with a faint rustling sound like a sorrowful sigh. Outside, the world continued to move. Distant cars rolled by, voices carried from far away. Everything as normal, as if nothing had happened. But inside the thick walls of the courthouse, a brutal truth had just been buried beneath collective denial. No one wanted to see, no one dared to listen, no one had the courage to speak. Amara, still inside that room, clung to her lock of hair, whispering for her mother in hopelessness. The long hallway now stretched between her loneliness and the silence of those outside. Every footstep walking away, every every averted gaze was another invisible blade digging deeper into a wound that had no chance to heal. And from that moment on, Amara's tragedy was no longer just the pain of a single child. It became a mirror reflecting silent complicity, the silence rooted deep in the foundations of places once called temples of justice. The courthouse still stood tall, cold, and indifferent, as if it had never witnessed anything at all. But in every crack between the bricks and every shadowed hallway, the story of the severed hair and Amara's whispered mama had etched itself into the walls. It needed no retelling, no written record only. The collective silence was enough to turn truth into a ghost hiding forever in the dark corners where justice had been twisted. And from the moment that young Staffer bowed his head and walked away, the courthouse hallway was no longer a neutral space. It had become proof of a painful truth: cruelty endures not only through those who inflict it, but through those who choose to look away. The sound of the metal door closing echoed like a hammer strike bouncing through the narrow room before dissolving into a suffocating hum. The cold walls shivered slightly, marking the moment power sealed itself in and trapped a small soul inside. Amara collapsed to the ground, hands trembling as she held the remaining strands of her hair. The wooden chair behind her tilted and one leg struck the floor with a harsh crack. On the stained tile, clumps of hair lay scattered and curled, catching the pale glow of the neon light above, standing out like evidence of a crime that needed no blood to prove. Every strand that hit the ground was a cut into the soul, now circling her chair like a barricade, a silent reminder that something precious had been taken from her in a flash. Outside in the hallway, footsteps approached, then stopped just as the door's vibration faded. One of Bradley's colleagues, a man used to witnessing the harsher sides of the job, could not hide his displeasure this time. He shook his head slightly, lips tightening into a thin line, then spoke in a low but firm voice that cut through the thick silence. Bradley, that was too much. His words weren't defiance, not brave enough to intervene, but a weary sigh, an admission that the line between discipline and abuse had just disappeared. The sound slipped into the room, reached Amara's ears, and for a fleeting moment a faint spark lit up inside her that someone at least had noticed how far things had gone, even if they couldn't stop. Bradley stood in the hallway, eyes shifting toward her colleague, a faint smirk rising on her lips, more scorn than reply. She shrugged, still holding the glinting scissors in her hand, and replied with cold indifference, "A lesson. Their hair's just weeds." The words, "just weeds," hit the hallway floor and bounced back with the sting of naked humiliation. Then she turned her back and walked away as if finishing a routine task, her shoes hitting the tile with dry, deliberate sounds each step, pressing down with unapologetic finality. Inside the room, Amara remained frozen, breath uneven, her eyes fixed on the fallen hair scattered around her. The phrase "just weeds" echoed in her ears, each word a cold blade sinking into her chest. To Bradley, her hair meant nothing, just excess to be trimmed away. But to Amara, it was the bond to her mother, a sign of love and a symbol of her family and her community's culture. The offense wasn't just in the cutting, it had become a direct attack on her identity, her sense of self, and her pride. Amara shut her eyes, tears falling again, soaking into her sleeve, heavy as blood from an unseen wound. Outside, Bradley's colleague remained still, one hand buried deep in his pocket, eyes following the tall figure of the powerful woman walking away. He knew clearly he had just witnessed something that crossed a line, but the fear rooted deep in his core held him in place, stripping away any will to object. His turning away, like countless others before it, had only fueled Bradley's momentum, turning cruelty into habit, into unchecked authority. He said nothing more, just sighed, then turned and walked away from the hallway, leaving behind the cold room and the child still holding on to what little remained of her hair. Amara tried to take a deep breath, but the air in the room felt thick, her chest tight with pressure. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, the choked sobs she fought to suppress, and the scraping sound of the wooden chair as it shifted unevenly behind her. The cold, white light still shone down, highlighting highlighting the scattered strands of hair, turning the room into a silent crime scene. Amara reached out to pick them up, her small hands, trembling fingertips brushing gently, as if trying to gather up the pride that had been lost. But the more she gathered, the clearer it became. Her hair had been cut away, and with it a piece of her childhood had been torn apart. In the silence, Bradley's words still echoed, repeating in Amara's mind, just weeds, just weeds, just weeds. She lowered her head, tears soaking through the front of her shirt. Outside, the world kept moving, cars murmuring, distant horns passing beyond the narrow window, but none of it mattered in that moment. For Amara, the world had collapsed inside four walls and a wooden chair where her belief in justice had been crushed by a single short, cold, merciless sentence. She knew this wound would follow her for life, a wound with no blood but so deep it would never fade. Bradley's figure faded down the hallway, her footsteps disappearing, leaving behind a silence so heavy it became suffocating. The door remained firmly shut, sealing Amara off from the outside, trapping her in a shame that had not yet begun to fade. Pain didn't need lashes or blood, just a single cut and a few cruel words, and it was enough to shatter a spirit, leaving a child trembling in despair. From that moment on, the interrogation room was no longer a place of truth-seeking, but a space where justice had turned its back, where a child was forced to endure a brutal lesson delivered by someone who claimed to uphold the law. And every word Bradley had spoken, like invisible blades, had transformed a personal act of violence into something publicly unmasked, a cruelty made permanent. That memory would cling to Amara, marking her as a living witness to the brutality that had been allowed to thrive in silence. Outside that heavy interrogation room, the world kept moving, still noisy and unaware that within those four walls a tragedy had just been carved into a child's soul. But only a few hours later, as the afternoon light poured down the courthouse hallways, a truth once thought to be locked away began to slip out. In a hidden corner, a court intern, a final-year law student, who had happened to be in the hallway the moment Bradley raised the scissors, had quickly lifted his phone. His hands shook, his heart pounded, and though he didn't dare do much, instinct told him this moment needed to be kept because it had crossed the line of ordinary discipline. The blurry, trembling video, dimly lit and unsteady with fear, still managed to capture the scissors sweeping past Amara's hair, and Bradley's sharp voice echoing through the room, "Sit still. You're going to learn your place." As the steel door slammed shut, the student remained pressed to the wall, hands trembling with fear of being caught, sweat soaking through his palms. But the phone in his grip now held a truth Bradley had tried to bury. At first, he hesitated, eyes darting around, fear creeping in that if he went public, he could lose everything, his internship, his career just beginning. But then he remembered Amara's tear-filled eyes, the whisper, "Mama," in that moment of despair, and he knew silence would make him an accomplice. He unlocked his phone, carefully clipped the video to keep only the critical moment, then exhaled hard as he hit share. The video appeared on an anonymous account with a single caption, "Is this how they treat a 12-year-old child?" Within minutes, the first clicks turned the short clip into a spark. The screen lit up with comment after comment, each one striking hard at the wall of silence Bradley had built. The first line appeared cold and cutting. Cutting hair equal cutting dignity. More followed, a flood of outrage filling the thread. "This is humiliation, not discipline. A child is not a tool for asserting power. Who gave police the right to do this to an innocent girl?" The anger spread quickly from a few voices to hundreds, then thousands. The video lasted less than a minute, but in every frame the truth was clear, the gleam of the scissors, the harsh shout, the restrained tear. No further explanation was needed. The truth was exposed, raw, and undeniable. Within hours, the clip spread across platforms, from small friend groups to larger communities, from personal posts to public forums. The outrage was joined by a growing hashtag, simple but powerful, hashtag Justice for Amara. That hashtag appeared first as a spark, but was instantly picked up and carried like a torch. On the personal pages of students from Amara's school, The image of the severed hair appeared with the caption, "We will not stay silent." On community forums, people ask, if it's Amara today, who will it be tomorrow? Human rights activists quickly joined in, adding the strength of their networks and collective voice. Each share, each comment was like a stone thrown into still water, creating a ripple that could no longer be stopped. Inside that dim room, Amara still sat clutching the lock of hair, unaware that the world outside was beginning to stir for her. She remained wrapped in silence, believing the shame would be buried, that no one would be brave enough to speak. But out there across phone screens, her story had become a symbol. People didn't just see the cut hair, they saw injustice exposed, saw silent complicity being called out. The video needed no narration because the images spoke for themselves, and the hashtag Justice for Amara had become a rallying cry for thousands of voices joined as one. Comment after comment created a furious chorus, each note a demand to restore Amara's dignity. Someone wrote, "Hair can grow back, but what about a child's honor?" Another stated, "Cutting hair is erasing identity. This isn't discipline, it's cultural violence." Those words echoed across the internet, turning outrage from a private reaction into a public fire. And through that wave, the image of Amara holding the severed lock became an unforgettable symbol. The intern's phone buzzed endlessly with notifications, the share count climbing by the minute. His eyes blurred with both fear and relief. He knew he had risked everything, his future, his safety, but he also knew the truth had to be seen. The glow of the screen lit up his young face, revealing a resolve shaped by that moment of helplessness in the hallway. His hands still trembled, but his eyes were steadier now, carrying the belief that what had just been released could no longer be silenced. And he had no idea that by nightfall, the hashtag Justice for Amara would reach beyond the courthouse walls, past the small neighborhood, and into the hearts of strangers, united by shared outrage. While Amara sat in the cold darkness, holding the lock of hair that still carried her mother's scent, the world outside was lit up by glowing phone screens. Each voice, each sentence, each edited image was weaving together a tapestry of outrage. And on that tapestry, the name Amara was now etched not as an anonymous child in an interrogation room, but as a symbol of collective pain. One video, one click had torn through the silence, turning truth into fire, burning through the lies, and igniting a fight that could not be undone. The hashtag Justice for Amara from that moment on was no longer just a line of text. It had become a vow that justice could not be silenced, that the severed hair would mark the beginning of a movement. And Amara, still curled up in the dark, had unknowingly stepped into the center of a storm where personal shame would turn into collective strength, where silence would be replaced by a chorus echoing through every corner. The city's central square, once filled with hurried footsteps, street vendors, and familiar bursts of music, had today been overtaken by a different wave. From early morning, small groups began to gather, first a few dozen, then quickly hundreds, all holding up images of Amara's unevenly cut hair. The image, taken from the shaky video shared the night before, had been printed on paper, mounted on cardboard, and raised high in clenched hands. Under the sunlight pouring down on the square, those images became hundreds of accusing arms, exposing the silent crime of Bradley, turning Amara's severed hair into evidence the city could not ignore. Each photo was a shard of a mirror, reflecting shared grief and transforming the truth from that dark room into a public indictment in broad daylight. Step by step, the crowd moved in rhythm, voices echoing through the open space, her hair, her dignity. The chant rang out like a battle drum, cutting through the air and stopping passers-by in their tracks. Raised hands and unified voices no longer sounded like scattered cries from behind screens. They had become a collective force. Every word spoken carried fury, aiming to rip apart the polished mask of power. Circles of students formed, shouting in unison, eyes burning with anger. On their young faces there was no apathy, only the fierce light of conviction that the humiliation of a 12-year-old child would not be forgotten. In the middle of the crowd, a young male student with a megaphone suddenly stepped onto the stone steps, his voice breaking with emotion but rising strong. "If this is justice, then justice is wrought." The shout ripped through the air, turning hundreds of faces upward, all eyes locking on the image of Amara frozen mid-haircut. The statement was met with a roar of applause followed by a chorus of shouts echoing off the surrounding walls, creating waves of sound that made it impossible for anyone to pretend they hadn't heard. That sentence, like an arrow shot straight at the system, declared that if what Bradley had done was called justice, then the system itself was decayed at its roots. What began as whispers online had turned into a roaring fire. People brought portable speakers, replaying the video again and again. In the middle of the square, Bradley's shouting voice echoing, blending with chants of her hair, her dignity, to create an angry harmony. Local journalists arrived, cameras sweeping across flushed faces and raised signs. Television reporters went live, the banner scrolling across screens. Citizens take to the streets demanding justice for Amara. Lenses zoomed in on hand-lettered posters, tearful eyes, clenched fists, and beamed it all across the nation. What had been contained in a single video was now a visible movement spilling through the streets of the city. In the crowd were mothers holding their children, eyes lit with both heartbreak and pride. Middle-aged men stood quietly in formation, their hoarse voices joining the chants like a release of years of buried frustration. Elderly women and men, hair silver and hands unsteady, held up pictures of Amara, voices trembling but firm. Justice is not humiliation. From the young to the old, everyone saw part of themselves in Amara's pain. In their eyes, this was no longer the story of one girl, it was a shared wound, a reminder that silence in the face of injustice would only create more Amaras. Online, thousands shared live streams from the square. Each broadcast drew tens of thousands of views with comment threads stretching endlessly. People posted, crying and angry emojis writing, "We stand with Amara." Hair was cut, but dignity remains. If we stay silent today, tomorrow it will be our child. The crowd in the square merged with the crowd on the internet. Two worlds joined together, turning one cruel act behind closed doors into the focus of an entire city, perhaps an entire nation. Amara wasn't there. She still sat in the cold room clutching the severed hair, but her image was everywhere, on banners, on phone screens, on the news. She had become a symbol that would not fade. Everyone at the protest saw in her photo the trampling of innocence, the pain turned into fury, and the reminder that justice had to be reclaimed. And as the sun began to set, the square was washed in orange and red light, and the fire of outrage didn't fade, it burned even brighter beneath the dusk. International reporters began posting images. Major news outlets picked up the story with headlines that stunned justice cut along with a child's hair. The event crossed local lines, becoming a global moment. The story of Amara's hair from a shaky clip had become a symbol of resistance, of collective voices rising against abuse of power. Every frame, every chant, every line written on cardboard joined together to create a wave that could not be put out. The central square felt like a giant heart, its pulse spreading everywhere. Every chant was a heartbeat, every gaze a flame, every sign a vein running through the city, and all of them shared a single vow: the severed hair would not fall in silence. It would mark the beginning of a journey to reclaim justice, so that Amara's voice would not be buried in a dark room, but would echo far and wide, reaching every heart. The old blue city bus rolled slowly through crowded streets, its engine rumbling and brakes hissing softly each time it stopped for passengers. The usual noise, inside chatter, playful kids' music from phones was absent today. A man, seated midway down the aisle, wearing a dark shirt, pulled out his phone and turned the volume up. At once, the shaky video appeared, its glow lighting up the cramped space. Bradley raising the scissors, her sharp command the first sweep across Amara's hair. Everything was there playing out in front of the passengers. Bradley's hissed laughter and Amara's desperate trembling echoed from the tiny speaker, but it was enough to silence the entire bus. Eyes turned toward the screen. The man raised the phone higher so others could see, and within seconds the usual rhythm of the bus had changed. An elderly woman in the front row leaned back, tear-filled eyes locked on the image of Amara holding her severed hair. A boy, around 10, sat beside his mother, mouth agape, his hand clinging to her sleeve as he whispered without sound. In the back, a group of college students who had been chatting loudly now fell quiet, their eyes fixed on the video faces flushed with anger. When Bradley barked, "Sit, still you're going to learn your place," several passengers flinched as if they themselves had just been insulted. At that moment, a middle-aged man with a sun-darkened face sitting by the window let out a quiet sentence that everyone heard: "Cops don't even spare children now." His voice caught not a question but a sigh of despair. His words spread through the bus like a knock on each conscience. A young woman beside him nodded firmly, her eyes wet, murmuring, "That child didn't do anything." But just as the sense of shared empathy seemed to unite the bus, another voice rose from the back, cold, confrontational. The girl deserved to be taught a lesson. The entire bus froze, the space tightening for a moment. The young man, holding the phone, turned stunned, while the elderly woman in front snapped, "What did you just say?" The man who had spoken shrugged, voice steady. "Don't make a big deal out of it." She needed to listen. What's the big deal about hair? Cutting it to teach her fear might be good. That sentence was like a spark thrown into a barrel of fuel. Angry eyes shot toward the man, and the atmosphere erupted into an argument. The middle-aged man from before clenched his jaw, turned around fully, and growled, "Cutting hair to make her obey? That's not discipline. That's humiliation." A female student in the back row stood up abruptly, her voice trembling but firm. "Do you even know what hair means to us? Its identity, its culture. Don't you dare call that teaching." The young man scoffed, shrugging, "You're all too sensitive. Cops get criticized for everything." The whole bus broke into protest voices, overlapping in a rising wave that made the vehicle tremble in chaos. The air was thick, tense, like a stretched wire. The driver glanced quickly into the rearview mirror, then returned to the wheel, but it was clear even he was caught in the current of debate. Those who had stayed silent now joined in frustration, spilling out in bursts. "What if that were your daughter? Did you see her eyes? She's a kid. No one has the right to call a child's dignity a weed." The retorts came hard and fast, drowning out the sneer and laugh until the young man's face turned red. Just as he opened his mouth again, a sharp voice cut in, "Shut up. Don't use cruelty to justify justice." The phone screen still glowed brightly, replaying the moment Amara's hair fell to the tile floor. Her eyes in the clip sent a chill through many on the bus. A young woman, clutching her daughter in the seat beside her, burst into tears, pulling her child close and whispering, "Sweetheart, don't ever think you have to go through something like that." The entire bus now simmered in a mix of outrage and empathy. The video had gone beyond being just a recording. It had become a mirror, forcing everyone to confront their own fears. The argument didn't end with a few exchanged words. It expanded into a full-blown clash of perspectives, splitting the bus in two. One side condemned Bradley's actions as cruel humiliation, while a small few tried to defend the police's authority to punish. But the majority quickly drowned them out, unified voices pushing back against any excuse. Each protest landed like a hammer blow, smashing through the last defense of those who sought to justify. The air was dense, no one paying attention to stoplights or the next station. The bus had become a heated forum, and at its center was Amara's butchered hair. The bus swayed through every turn, but inside everyone's hearts beat in sync. The fury in the air made it stifling, so much so that windows were opened to let in air, but the breeze only fed the flames. When the bus pulled into the next stop, a few people stepped off, still talk in hands, gesture and voices thick with anger. New passengers stepped on and were immediately pulled into the storm-handed phones and shown the clip. In just seconds, their eyes darkened too, and their voices joined the chorus, "Justice for Amara." The atmosphere on the bus was no longer the usual calm, but had turned into a battlefield of ideas. That video, with the raw power of its images and sounds, had transformed a public vehicle into a fierce debate over dignity, justice, and truth. Amara, though absent, was present in every word spoken, in every glance exchanged, in every tear shed. And the bus sped through the city, carrying not just its passengers, but a wave of outrage that had just been set alight. It signaled that the storm sparked by a severed braid would continue to spread, and no wall would be thick enough to hold it back. Inside the meeting room, where the walls were lined with framed photos commemorating the force, the atmosphere hung heavy like a boulder pressing down on everyone's shoulders. Leather chairs were arranged around the long table, but no one had the composure to sit properly. The screen on the wall still displayed images of the crowd gathering in the square, bold red slogans running across the live video feed. A senior officer stood abruptly, pulled off his glasses, and slammed them on the table, his voice hoarse with tension. "The video is everywhere. There's no hiding it now." His eyes scanned the room and stopped on Bradley, the fatigue in his gaze making it clear that any defense at this point was meaningless. Bradley sat with her arms crossed back, straight eyes locked on her colleagues. Her teeth clenched as she spat each word. "I acted by the rules. That child needed discipline." The statement echoed through the room, dry and rigid, drawing furrowed brows from several officers. They knew full well the cameras had captured every second that what had gone online couldn't be erased with a single line. A younger lieutenant tapped his pen sharply on the table, his voice tight with frustration. "Discipline doesn't mean cutting a child's hair. You're tearing down the trust this system took decades to build." The room grew thick with division, two opposing currents clashing without end. A few officers at the back exchanged glances, sighed, and turned their eyes away as if trying to withdraw from the debate, but those remaining in the center were taut as a wire. Bradley held her ground, face unmoved like forged steel fingers, tapping rhythmically against the table as if underscoring her resolve. She turned toward the commanding officer at the head of the table and raised her voice. "Outsiders don't understand our rules. They see one angle and pass judgment. I did my duty as a cop trying to teach someone beneath me where the line is." The commander, a man seasoned by years in the force, leaned back with arms folded, eyes fixed on the thick stack of files in front of him. He didn't answer right away, just took a long breath before speaking in a quiet but steady tone. "The whole world is watching us now, Bradley. Every word you say, every move you've made has gone beyond the walls of an interrogation room. This isn't internal anymore." His words drew sharper stares toward Bradley, each glance like a blade piercing the wall of confidence she had built. A heavy silence blanketed the room, broken only by the steady ticking of the wall clock. Then another voice spoke up, this time from a young officer recently transferred in. "People are marching because they can't accept our silence. If we keep standing by her, we're making ourselves complicit." His words stirred a wave of murmurs. Someone slammed a hand on the table, another shook their head in frustration, and the tension in the room rose quickly. Bradley smirked faintly, but a flicker of unease passed through her eyes. Though she tried to maintain a hardened front, the growing criticism from within her own ranks was slowly eating away at her pride. Outside traffic hummed faintly through the glass, but inside the meeting room every sound echoed like a pressure building up. The debate was no longer about a single video. It had become a test for the entire force. One side clung to rigid rules to justify the act, while the other feared the collapse of public trust. Every word spoken fell like a hammer blow, shaking the already cracked foundation. And in each person's mind, the same question lingered: would they protect a colleague at all costs, or choose justice to preserve what little honor remained? The meeting ended under a thick cloud of contradiction, and no one left their seat without carrying its weight. Bradley's statement still rang in many ears, but At the same time, the chant, her hair, her dignity from the square playing through the live stream on the screen had turned truth into a fracture too deep to seal. From that moment on, the police meeting room was no longer a space of discipline and orders, but a battlefield of division where every glance, every word revealed the cracks forming beneath the surface warning of storms yet to come. An officer, sitting near the table, suddenly stood his chair, screeching loudly across the tile floor, making everyone flinch. His face flushed red, his hand slammed the wood so hard the files jumped, and his voice roared, stripped of its usual restraint. "Cutting hair isn't the law." The words sliced through the dense air like a blade, laying bare the truth everyone had thought, but no one dared to say. Everyone in the room, from those avoiding eye contact to those about to speak up, froze. All eyes turned toward Bradley, whose expression stayed tense, though a flicker of doubt passed behind her rigid stare. No one spoke after that statement. Only the ticking of the wall clock echoed loud and clear. The silence stretched on, but within that stillness every furrowed brow, every shake of the head, every sigh revealed a simmering agreement. The officer who had just spoken didn't sit down, his eyes scanning the room silently, asking his colleagues. Did any of them have the courage to admit Bradley's actions were wrong? Some looked down, fingers spinning their pens again and again. Others stared out the window to avoid meeting his gaze. A few scribbled quick notes into their files, but none could hide the rising tension in the room. Bradley clenched her teeth chin, lifted high lips, curling into a defiant half smile, but the sound of her laugh was dry. She looked as if she was about to respond, but the silence had already made clear that the fracture was showing. An older inspector, known for his neutrality, gently pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and spoke in an even tone, each word falling like water onto stone. "We're trained to maintain order, not to humiliate. If the public thinks we act like bullies, every bit of our honor collapses." The words struck like another blow to Bradley's armor, and for a moment she went still, blinking quickly to steady herself. Inside the meeting room, the once heavy air now churned like a storm on the verge of breaking. Some leaned back with arms crossed, eyes narrowing as if calculating an exit, while others furrowed their brows, taking deep breaths to hold back frustration. Small whispers began to ripple from one corner to another, no one trying to maintain perfect silence anymore. What had started as a crisis meeting had turned into a mirror reflecting internal division. Everyone could see that the wall of unity was cracking, and those tiny fractures were spreading fast, threatening to split wide open. The commander at the head of the table remained silent, but his hands were tightly clasped across his chest, each finger stiff with tension. He knew the words just spoken couldn't be taken back. They had exposed a bitter truth. The fracture within the force was now undeniable, no longer hidden behind forced smiles or reluctant nods. In every officer's eyes, from anger to unease, from disappointment to bitter realization, one thing was clear. This incident hadn't only sparked outrage outside, it had shaken the very foundation of a system built on discipline and trust. And now that the cracks were exposed, no one could say for certain what the coming storm would destroy. Only that lost credibility is hard to regain, and conflicts once ignited linger like scars that never heal. That morning, when Amara walked through the school gate, the entire courtyard seemed to fall silent, as if the usual laughter and chatter had been caught mid-air. Every eye turned toward her, and though no one spoke, the silence was heavier than any ridicule. Her once long hair, carefully braided, was now reduced to uneven stubs, jagged like a wound not yet healed. Amara tried to walk faster, but her worn shoes hitting the tiled floor echoed with weight, dragging her hesitant steps into the classroom. A few classmates turned away to wipe their eyes. Some bowed their heads in quiet solidarity, while others looked on in confusion, not understanding why a child should bear such humiliation. That air of heaviness made Amara feel even smaller. She bit her lip to hold back tears, but the tightness still rose to her throat, making each breath feel torn apart. In the classroom, the homeroom teacher entered with a face sterner than usual. She glanced at Amara, then at the silent class, feeling the weight of collective anger. After class, when reporters arrived, the teacher stood in front of the cameras, her voice shaken with emotion yet clear. Cut in her hair is cut in her dignity. Her words rang out and lingered in the air like an accusation. This was no longer just Amara's story, it had become a message to all of society. The reporters captured every word, every glimmer of tears in her eyes, and the quote appeared on the front pages of newspapers and spread rapidly across social media. People shared the image of the teacher holding Amara's hand, her face resolute before the camera, and from there, her statement became a new slogan in the growing movement. Inside the classroom, silence still hung, but it was no longer awkward or distant. Classmates quietly sat closer to Amara. A few placed folded notes on her desk with messages of encouragement. "You are not alone. Hair will grow back, but justice must stand." Those few words made Amara tear up. She clutched the notes tightly in her hand and, for the first time in days, felt a bit of warmth from the care around her. The teachers at school decided to organize an emergency forum where students could share their thoughts on the incident, and immediately young voices rose up surprisingly strong. Justice is meant to protect, not to humiliate. The school hallway that day buzzed with the presence of cameras, reporters, and concerned onlookers. Amara's cropped hair became the center of attention, but no longer a reason for her to bow her head. It had become a symbol for the entire community to face the wound inflicted on a child. Everyone who witnessed it understood that this story had gone far beyond a single incident. It had become a mirror reflecting the truth that justice cannot exist if truth is suppressed. And as Amara sat quietly among her classmates, a feeling both painful and warm rose within her, pain for what she had lost, but warmth in knowing she was not alone, that her suffering had become the shared voice of thousands. The image of Amara with her unevenly cut hair quickly appeared on the front pages of major newspapers, no longer an anonymous child, but a symbol of public humiliation. A photo capturing the moment she held the strands of hair scattered on the floor was printed in bold across the page, accompanied by a haunting headline, "When Honor Was Cut with Her Hair." The image spread rapidly, appearing in television broadcasts, online platforms, and being reprinted in social commentary columns. People looked into her tear-filled yet resolute eyes and realized that Bradley's actions were no longer just about one child, but a scar left on the dignity of an entire community. Amara became the center of discussions, debates, and a living proof of abuse of power laid bare before the public. Public discourse ignited as expert scholars and human rights advocates spoke out. They emphasized that hair is not merely a form of appearance, but a cultural symbol and source of pride. When it is stripped away, it equals a blow to one's dignity. Many opinion pieces affirmed that the act had crossed the line of discipline and turned into an unforgivable public degradation. Bold headlines in the press and sharp commentary on live broadcasts transformed Amara from a silent victim into a symbol of resistance, forcing society to confront a critical question. Does justice truly exist when those wearing badges are the ones spreading humiliation? In the surging current of information, the news finally reached Marcus Reed. The federal judge, usually reserved and buried in the cold silence of courtrooms and thick stacks of case files, suddenly stopped in front of the screen airing a special report. His eyes locked onto the face of his daughter as it appeared on television, a young face drenched in tears, her unevenly shorn hair exposing deep hurt. His chest tightened, the file in his hands trembled, and his heartbeat quickened as if each frame was a blade carving into a father's heart. The anchor's voice came steady. Footage of the 12-year-old girl whose hair was cut by police has shocked the public. Her father, federal judge Marcus Reed, has yet to make a statement. The words froze him in place eyes, 100 questions racing through his mind, but above all was an overwhelming sense of anguish. Marcus Reed had devoted his life to upholding justice, but in that moment he realized justice had been violated inside his own family. He was no longer just a judge reviewing files. He was a father witnessing his child turned into a victim before millions of eyes. Amara's pain was no longer private. It had crossed the courtroom threshold, struck the heart of society, and now demanded that her life. His eyes shifted from misty to resolute. His face tightened as if in that instant he took on the burden not only of a father, but of the very justice system now on trial. And as the screen continued showing protest slogans echoing everywhere, Marcus Reed quietly set the file down, took a deep breath, and knew the storm had truly begun. The morning at the courthouse carried an unusual tension. The cold stone steps were already crowded with reporters and citizens waiting. Inside, the preliminary hearing room was lit brightly by dozens of lights, the audience seats packed with burning eyes, eager to catch every word. The heavy wooden door opened, and Officer Bradley entered, her shoes striking the stone floor with echoing force. She held her head high, her eyes swept defiantly across the room, her lips pressed into a hard line carrying the belief that the machinery of authority would shield her, that her years of service in uniform and badge were enough to keep the system from abandoning her. Confidence radiated in her stride as if the outcry outside had nothing to do with her. She took her seat at the defendant's table, hands clasped fingers, tapping lightly like someone waiting for their turn to prove their case. Facing Bradley on the plaintiff's side, the human rights attorney representing Amara stood, his posture crisp and his eyes steady. He opened a thick case file, his voice low but firm, each sentence landing like a hammer striking the table. This indictment clearly states that the defendant's actions not only violated professional standards but directly inflicted emotional harm and assaulted the dignity of a 12-year-old child. The room fell silent, each word ringing out, hitting the walls and rippling through, causing many in the audience to clench their fists. He continued, his voice stronger now, not shying away from Bradley's defiant stare. This was not discipline. This was humiliation, an attack on the victim's culture and identity. A cut strand of hair is no small matter. It is a cut to dignity. And justice here cannot be blind. The court reporter carefully transcribed each word while the pens of journalists rose in unison, scribbling quickly, afraid to miss a detail. The camera lights moved slowly across Bradley's tense face, then stopped at Amara's tear-reddened eyes as she sat in the front row beside her father. The girl kept her head down, hands tightly folded in her lap, yet it was clear her entire story was being voiced in the weight of every line read aloud. The soft sound of pages turning and the quickened breaths of the courtroom made the air feel thick. Everyone sensed this was no ordinary case, but the opening moment of a confrontation backed by an entire system. Bradley remained seated, eyes forward, trying to maintain her defiance, but she couldn't hide the brief tightness in her mouth as the charges were read. The human rights attorney pressed on his voice like an arrow, sharp and deliberate, emphasizing each point. No one has the right to use scissors to teach a child. No one is allowed to turn her body and culture into tools for displaying power. And today, this system must face that truth. In the silence that followed the accusation, the sound of the judge's gavel echoed sharply through the courtroom, signaling a turning point in the story. All eyes from the gallery, from the press rows, and from those watching online turned toward Bradley. And in that moment, the wall of protection she had once believed unshakable began to crack right here in the preliminary hearing. Millions of eyes from every corner were focused on the courtroom where the hearing was being streamed live across digital platforms. On phone screens, computers, televisions, each moment of the trial was broadcast clearly from the stern face of the judge to the tense posture of those seated in the front rows. The air inside inside the courtroom was thick, almost tangible. No one dared whisper, even breaths were taken carefully. That silence amplified every small sound, the flipping of a page, the tap of a pen, adding to the pressure bearing down on everyone present. The room pulsed with anticipation as if the crowd were holding their breath, waiting for truth to break free. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered before a large screen set up by reporters, all eyes fixed, murmurs quickly swallowed by the collective tension. Inside, the evidence box was placed solemnly on the table, guarded by 2 officers. Inside lay the most critical piece of evidence, sealed carefully, the gleaming pair of scissors once held in Bradley's hand. As the court official opened the box and lifted it out, the ceiling lights caught the steel blade flashing a cold, sharp glint. Every eye in the room, from spectators to judges, from reporters to Amara's family, locked onto that small object. It was no longer a simple tool, but a symbol of abused authority, a silent witness to an act of humiliation. Its presence thickened the already heavy atmosphere, stirring a wave of anger just from the sight of the blade. Bradley sat still. Her eyes blinked once as the scissors were raised into view, then quickly regained her composure, hands clasped, trying to remain calm. But no effort could hide the truth as the images in the video and the object in the official's hand aligned too perfectly to leave room for defense. The human rights attorney stepped forward to seize the moment, his voice clear and resonant. "This is the instrument that humiliated a child, not a symbol of the law, but proof of disgrace." His words rang out like a second blade, sinking Bradley beneath the weight of every furious stare in the room. Outside, thousands following the live stream on social media unleashed their fury all at once. Comments flooded the screen. "That pair of scissors says it all. There's no denying it. This is the truth. Justice must be served." People weren't just watching, they were participating in the trial, turning their viewership into direct pressure on the system. In the square, chants of "justice for Amara" rose once again, joined by applause, as the image of the scissors appeared clearly on the big screen. In that moment, the whole world seemed to pause, with only the cold glint of the blade and the pounding hearts of viewers filling the silence. An object once considered harmless had now become a symbol of resistance, a piece of evidence no one could ignore. And from that second on, every eye understood that justice could no longer turn back, because those scissors had become undeniable proof, forcing everyone to face the raw truth. The faint buzzing of the projector filled the courtroom as the original video was played before the entire audience. The footage on the large screen held everyone's gaze, each shaky frame capturing every movement with chilling clarity. In the dim light of the interrogation room, the shiny scissors moved close to Amara's hair, and the sound of metal slicing through the air echoed coldly. Then the horrifying moment came. A dry snip, the black lock falling to the cold tile floor, followed by Bradley's threatening shout. That sound, alone, already enough to make hearts clench now, magnified in the courtroom, turned every word, every noise into a knife cutting deep into the minds of those watching. Every second of the video tore through the silence, forcing all to witness the raw truth. Amara's face appeared on the screen, her lips bitten until they bled, tears rolling down her cheeks without a single cry. Her small body, trembled hands flailing to hold onto the hair being taken from her, the damage laid bare without need for explanation. When the scissors moved in for a second cut, gasps broke out in the courtroom. Some raised hands to their mouths, others turned away, unable to bear it. But no one spoke because what played on screen was too real, too cruel. The courtroom was dead silent, the only sound coming from the video still playing. Not a chair moved, not a whisper was heard. The room frozen in the face of undeniable truth. Those who had hesitated, those who once defended Bradley, now sat silent, their faces frozen. Every eye locked onto the screen, then turned to Bradley. In the defendant's seat, she sat still, hands clenched together, her face briefly drained to color, but trying to stay composed. Yet, the light from the screen betrayed her, revealing tight lines across her forehead and a flash of worry that passed through her eyes. The human rights attorney watched the footage, his hand gripping the thick file, his voice quiet but booming like thunder. This evidence is enough to show the world the truth. This is not hearsay. This is not rumor. This is footage that cannot be denied. The judge's gavel struck to silence the rising murmurs from the gallery, reinforcing the undeniable weight of the evidence. Outside, the crowd watching the live stream erupted with comments, thousands of messages pouring in. No more denial. The truth is right here. Amara deserves justice. The courtroom became the only place where silence felt suffocatingly heavy. Every heartbeat, every glance, every breath locked onto the video that had just played until everyone understood that the game of words was over. No one could twist the images anymore. No argument could cover the truth. And from that moment on, Bradley lost her greatest support while Amara, though silent beside her father, now had the most powerful evidence to make the world hear her voice. Bradley tried to stay composed as the video ended, but the heavy silence in the courtroom made her seat feel like a furnace. The eyes, bearing down on her, carried contempt, outrage, and disappointment even from colleagues who once stood in the same ranks. Her hands began to tremble, her breath quickened, and suddenly, like someone pushed to the brink, Bradley burst out, her voice sharp and hoarse with strain. That kid needed discipline. The words rang out hard and bitter, shattering the silence and shaking the entire room. Some reporters rushed to focus their cameras, capturing the moment like the final piece that revealed everything. The human rights attorney raised his eyebrows, his face hardening while the judge tapped the gavel to restore order, but the words had already hit the public like a slap, confirming that the act was not a momentary lapse but rooted in a mindset that devalued a child's dignity. At that moment, outside the courthouse, the large crowd watching the live stream on the big screen also heard the words clearly. In an instant, outrage erupted like fire meeting dry grass. Protest signs rose high, applause, mixed with unified chants, echoed across the square. Justice for Amara. That fierce sound didn't just fill the streets. It seemed to pierce through the thick walls and reach the courtroom itself. It merged with the heavy breaths of those inside, forming a chorus of anger. People shouted, voices cracking with emotion, no longer distinguishable as students or workers or elders, but as one voice calling for justice. Bradley flinched, her eyes blinking rapidly, the faint smile she tried to hold on to now powerless. She turned her head left and right, hoping to find a supportive gaze, but saw only coldness, caution, even contempt. The chants outside grew louder, joined by drums, horns, and blaring speakers like a tidal wave crashing in and washing away every defense. Inside the courtroom, a few spectators stood up, unable to hide their emotions. A woman whispered with a choked voice, "That girl didn't deserve this." Feelings spread fast, turning into murmurs, then swelling into loud conversation. The judge was forced to strike the gavel repeatedly, the heavy thud of wood hitting the bench still not enough to drown out the noise outside. Justice for Amara became an unrelenting chant, overpowering Bradley's words, silencing every attempt at justification. In that moment, the authority of the badge, the uniform, and the rigid reasoning no longer held weight. All that remained was the truth laid bare and the thunderous voices of the people. At that moment, the scales of justice tipped completely, and Bradley, though still seated in the defendant's chair, became a prisoner of her own arrogance, while Amara's name echoed outside like a flag raised high, affirming the belief that dignity must never be cut away. Just as the chant outside the courthouse continued to roar into the courtroom, the hallway suddenly erupted with a new wave of tension. A young reporter, his hands trembling with excitement as he held his camera, had just received a never-before-seen clip. The footage captured Bradley during a prior session, her voice hoarse, clear, spitting out the venomous words, "Black hair doesn't deserve respect." The sound came from the tiny speaker of a phone, but its impact struck harder than anything happening inside the courtroom. The reporter immediately uploaded the clip to social media, and the words flashing across the screen sliced through the silence like a blade, confirming that the long-suspected racism now had undeniable proof. The hallway, packed with reporters, lawyers, and spectators following the trial, froze for a few seconds as the clip played, then erupted into a swarm of shocked voices. All eyes turned toward the phone screen. Some hands flew to mouths, others shook in fury, while more people raised their own phones to record and live stream the moment. Within minutes, the clip had spread across all platforms, triggering headlines everywhere. Bradley's racist confession, new evidence, from haircut to cultural contempt. The words, "black hair doesn't deserve respect," flashed across screens like a fresh wound, deepening the pain Amara already carried. At the end of the hallway, a group of high school students who had come to support Amara began to cry upon hearing the remark. A black girl clenched her friend's hand and whispered in fury, "They've looked down on us for so long, and now it's all out in the open." The crying, blended with angry shouts, slogans echoed off the narrow wall so loudly that court officers had to step in to maintain order. But even they couldn't hide their discomfort, as the fire in the crowd's eyes had clearly gone beyond the point of restraint. On social media, comments poured in at breakneck speed. Tens of thousands reposted the quote, "Black hair doesn't deserve respect," with outrage emojis, turning it into a reverse slogan, a fierce form of protest. People shared photos of Amara's chopped hair alongside the phrase, transforming it into irrefutable evidence of an insult the community would never forgive. Each share, each appearance of those words drove Bradley's career further into the ground under the weight of collective outrage. The air in the hallway thickened. Every step felt heavy with simmering anger. Reporters pushed in from every angle, microphones aimed in all directions, seeking reactions from witnesses, colleagues, anyone remotely connected. But everyone understood one thing from the moment that clip went public: there was no path left for Bradley. Any defense about discipline or protocol had become meaningless, because her own voice had exposed the truth that cutting Amara's hair wasn't just an abuse of power, it was an act of cultural contempt. Amid the wave of outrage, Amara's image appeared on posters plastered across the hallway, her tearful eyes facing directly the words, "Black hair doesn't deserve respect." That contrast cut like a blade into everyone's heart, turning personal pain into a collective storm. And as the echoing footsteps and thunderous chants from outside blended with the hallway's murmurs, it became clear to all that the fire of justice had been lit, and no one had the power to extinguish it. The clip spread like fire in the wind, quickly transforming what had been a crowd of watchers into a mass of enraged demonstrators. In front of the courthouse, more people flooded in, raising signs high, their faces tense, their eyes blazing, as if ready to burn down the cold stone walls. The chants of justice for Amara now merged with the pounding of drums and the blare of horns, forming a rhythm like the marching steps of a giant army. The atmosphere, once heavy with anger, now surged in waves, spreading through the streets. People poured out from markets, from schools, from offices, their voices unified in a rising chant. The streets filled to bursting, the crowd stretching endlessly, signaling that this storm of fury had grown far beyond a single incident and become a sweeping movement. Within that crowd were youthful faces lit by resolve, and older voices crying out as if finally releasing decades of suppressed rage. Each shout was a hammer blow shattering every last defense. Live streams from the scene were shared constantly, showing thousands of raised arms, hundreds of posters aimed at a single name, Bradley. By now, the outrage was no longer just an emotional reaction. It had become a collective force, drowning every attempt she made to cling to whatever dignity remained. The debates that had once divided were over. Public opinion had become a single current declaring that those who abuse power deserve no more chances. Inside the courtroom, when word of the uproar outside reached those within, Bradley's face went rigid. The justifications she once used as crutches now cracked and collapsed under the weight of outside reality. The credibility she had built throughout her career vanished in an instant. No one believed in titles anymore. No one cared about the badge on her chest. Colleagues who had remained silent now lowered their eyes, avoiding contact, knowing that any association with Bradley risked pulling them into the same abyss. Senior officials across the force distanced themselves, and the media no longer called her an officer. They plainly attached her name to the word racist. Bradley's career collapsed in an instant. Her reputation, once the foundation of her place in the police force, was reduced to ashes. From a figure of authority, she became the symbol of abuse and discrimination, exposed by the media, rejected by the community. The chants outside echoed like an unerasable indictment, repeating until even Bradley herself could no longer hide from the truth. There was no respect left, no allies, no protection from the system. She stood alone in the storm, and as her credibility crumbled, the fire of public outrage flared even higher, affirming that justice, though delayed, was finally emerging from the shadows. Inside the room, once known as the guardian of the department's integrity, Bradley sat with slumped shoulders, her face stripped of its usual arrogance. The curtains were drawn tight, and yellow light fell on a gleaming metal table, where a thick stack of files waited to be opened. She faced 3 investigators, their expressions stern and cold, offering no leniency. The recording device clicked on the red light, blinking, signaling that every word spoken would be preserved. Bradley swallowed hard, her throat dry, no trace of the commanding tone or imposing posture she once held in interrogation rooms. Each question came sharp, peeling back the layers of armor she had worn for years. The first investigator opened the file, his voice calm but firm. "You said your actions were disciplinary. Then, what about previous incidents? How do you explain the complaints from parents and residents in the areas you patrolled?" Bradley frowned, ready to respond, but was cut off by the sound of another file being opened. The page revealed clear descriptions of past conduct, aggressive behavior toward teenagers, repeated use of derogatory language while on duty. These cases had once been dismissed for lack of evidence or shielded by her internal reputation, but now all of them were laid bare. Another investigator continued, his eyes locked onto Bradley's. "Last year, at the Southern Market, you were accused of shoving a young girl during an ID check. Why did the internal report say citizen self-inflicted injury? Can you confidently state on record that you were not involved?" The room thickened with tension, the ceiling fan clicking overhead adding weight to the silence. Bradley pressed her lips together, her breath quickening, unable to give a clear answer. Every denial now only backed her further into a corner. The files kept opening each sheet, exposing another part of the past Bradley had hoped to bury. The cold text revealed how often she had overstepped, pulling over innocent drivers to assert dominance, ordering searches without warrants. Incidents once buried now stood in plain view, stacking into a mountain of accountability. No one in the room saw her as an officer anymore, but as a subject under investigation. Under the dim yellow light, Bradley slowly lost her final layer of defense. She sank into her chair, fingers gripping the edge of the cold metal table, but the chill did nothing to steady her. The accusations piled on every small detail from her past, now a stone hurled at a collapsed image. The authority she once wielded, the pride she had carried in her stare, was now replaced by disgrace and the sharp sting of contempt. The Internal Affairs Office had no chanting, no protest signs, but the silence and weight of the files were enough to turn the space into an execution ground. Bradley, who once believed herself untouchable, was now forced to sit and listen as her past mistakes were laid bare like a mirror reflecting her true nature. And when the final folder was placed on the table, she knew her career was over, that no foothold remained to save her. The interrogations came one after another, thickening the atmosphere in the investigation room, but what shook Bradley most was the betrayal from faces that once shared the same row of chairs, the same uniform. The first colleague entered, face, weary eyes, no longer a void in hers, voice, hoarse but firm. I saw her overstep her authority many times, but back then no one dared speak up. That sentence was like a stone thrown into a still lake, shattering the long-standing silence. One by one, others followed each statement another cut into the image Bradley had once crafted. A young female officer trembled her hand, clutching the hem of her shirt, but still forced the words out. I was told to falsify the report, to write that the victim was the aggressor. I didn't want to, but the pressure from above was too much. A tear fell, adding tension to the room because everyone understood this wasn't just an accusation but a confession of a truth buried too long. Bradley sat there, face pale, her gaze darting as colleague after colleague brought up her name and incidents once hidden. One officer, who had worked the same shift, recalled how she shouted at and shoved a teenager in the street without filing a report. Another confirmed witness to Bradley using derogatory language while checking the ID of an immigrant woman. Events once thought forgotten, once obscured by internal records, now resurfaced with clarity laid out plainly in front of her. Each statement was like a hammer blow, breaking the last pieces of credibility Bradley had left. The air in the investigation room was so dense that even breathing felt heavy. The investigators sat silently, taking notes, needing no interruption, as the string of violations painted a clear picture of someone who had wielded authority to spread fear instead of protecting justice. Bradley bit her lip, hands clenched tight, but found no escape. Her silence now was no longer pride, but proof of helplessness under the weight of accumulated wrongs. A long list of abuses, cover-ups, and efforts to frame victims now reads like a living indictment, leaving no one in the room still seeing her as a fellow officer. The name Bradley, once associated with the image of a stern officer, was now replaced by the word disgraced. The final report, summarizing the investigation results, was printed and stacked thick on the table, each page exposing the stains of a ruined career. No one mentioned medals or years of service anymore, all of it obscured by the flood of violations crashing down. Those who once stayed silent to protect her now spoke out together, leaving her isolated, abandoned in the whirlwind of truth. And under the pale yellow light, the image of Bradley, with her head bowed silently, facing the towering files of wrongdoing, marked the final end of all the credibility she had once struggled to hold on to. On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Not a single seat left empty, the yellow lights overhead illuminating the tense faces of everyone present. When Amara's name was called, the entire room fell silent, her small footsteps echoing like punctuation in the heavy air. She stood up and walked slowly to the witness stand, her frame thin, but her gaze no longer trembling like in the early days. Her hand rested on the microphone, her voice at first hesitant, then gradually clear and steady with each word. Hair is not a joke, it's pride. The statement struck the room a simple truth, carrying a weight far beyond her 12 years. Amara paused, eyes brimming, but no tears fell. She looked straight at the judge, then turned her gaze toward the defendant. Bradley sat there, her face tight, unable to hold eye contact with the clear, unwavering stare of the child she once belittled. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some bowed their heads in emotion, others wiped the corners of their eyes, and reporters scrambled to capture every word. Amara's statement wasn't just a defense of herself, but a declaration of the value of her community, of the culture braided into her hair. The representing attorney nodded in encouragement, then stepped back as Amara continued. She took a deep breath, her voice no longer shaky, but surprisingly firm. "When they cut my hair, they wanted me to bow my head. But I stand here, not to cry, but to say that we deserve respect." Her words ignited the room. A soft round of applause rose from the back rows, and the judge had to strike the gavel to call for order, though even his eyes reflected quiet approval. The whole world, watching through the live stream, witnessed a 12-year-old girl turn shame into fire, turning pain into a powerful affirmation of dignity. Bradley lowered her head, her hands clenched until pale, with no defense strong enough to counter. Every argument about discipline or protocol had crumbled before the simple words of a child, "Hair is not a joke." In the gallery, those who had once marched with signs now smiled softly, seeing that Amara had reclaimed her voice not just for herself, but for them too. Outside the courthouse, the crowd watching on the big screen erupted into applause chants, rising again in unison with each word she spoke, affirming that justice was no longer in the hands of the abuser, but returning to where it rightfully belonged. In that moment, Amara was no longer just a victim. She became a living witness to a movement, a testament to the power of courage. Her voice, small but resolute, echoed not only within the courtroom walls but in the hearts of millions watching. And as she stepped down from the witness stand, the room remained silent, wrapped in the resonance of her brief statement like a declaration that needed no embellishment, yet carried enough weight to close a long, dark chapter and open a belief that justice may be delayed but will never be buried. The human rights attorney stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the thick folder already opened, his eyes scanning each member of the bench. His voice rang out evenly, not loud but strong enough to strike directly into the hearts of those holding their breath. "This is not just an act, it is an insult to an entire culture." The words fell like a blade, cutting through the silence, shaking the courtroom. He paused, letting each word settle in the air, then continued. "A cut of hair can grow back, but dignity once trampled leaves scars across generations. When a child is treated this way, we are no longer discussing an isolated incident, but an offense to the community, to tradition, to the roots of human dignity." His firm words stirred the crowd. Some nodded with tears, others gripped their seats to contain their anger. The courtroom slowly quieted, leaving only the soft scratching of pens and the pounding heartbeats of those awaiting judgment. The judge, seated at the center, looked pensive yet firm, adjusted his glasses, then turned to the defendant. Bradley kept her head bowed, face, pale hands clenched tightly in her lap, the arrogance she once wore reduced to a trembling shadow. No defense remained to be spoken for. Everything had already been laid bare before the light of justice. The photos, the testimonies, the original video, and above all, Amara's steady voice had shattered every facade, turning the truth into an undeniable verdict. As the moment of judgment approached, the air in the room thickened as if every breath was trapped in each chest. When the judge struck the gavel, the sound reverberated through the courtroom. Each knock hit in the stone floor like a blow to the heart. His voice was low but clear. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, the court finds the defendant, Bradley, guilty. She is hereby stripped of her badge and permanently removed from the force." The words slammed shut like a heavy door, ending all debate, marking the total downfall of an officer who once believed she was untouchable. The courtroom erupted with murmurs. Some people burst into tears, others clapped loudly despite the call for order. Amara sat next to her father, her eyes brimming but filled with relief, her lips pressing into a trembling smile. Marcus Reed placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, his gaze fixed on the judge's bench, saying nothing, but his face clearly etched with the resolve that justice had finally prevailed. Outside the courthouse, the crowd watching the giant screen erupted in cheers. The chant, "Justice for Amara," roared, blending with the pounding of drums that echoed across the square. In that moment, Bradley was no longer an officer, no longer had a badge, and no longer held any power. She stepped down with dazed eyes, surrounded by the clamor of reporters, the scornful looks of her colleagues, and the mix of vindication and emotion from the public. The sentence did more than strip her of a title. It sent a strong message that every act of degrading human dignity must come at a cost. And in the roar of the crowd, the name Amara was no longer tied to the image of a shamed victim, but had become a symbol of resilience, of truth triumphing over the darkness of abuse. Late in the day, the central square was filled with the soft yellow glow of thousands of candles. The crowd was packed tightly, from elderly people with canes, mothers holding small children, to young people carrying hastily painted signs in red. Together, they raised fake braids made of black yarn, each lock swaying in the wind, as a symbol of remembrance for Amara. The image was both mournful and powerful, clearly illustrating the connection between one person's pain and the strength of a collective. As each person lifted the braids high, the space fell into a quiet moment that somehow echoed loudly in the hearts of everyone present. The flickering candlelight stretched across the square, reflecting off the faces of thousands, creating a shimmering sea of light in the heart of the city. The name Amara was shouted in unison, each syllable echoing like waves bouncing off tall wall. Amara, Amara. The call wasn't just for a 12-year-old girl, but a wake-up cry for conscience, a statement that justice must not be forgotten. A group of students standing at the front began to cry, but held each other's hands tightly, shouting her name with all their strength. In the distance, news cameras slowly panned across the sea of people, capturing every moment to be broadcast around the world, making the scene no longer confined to a single square, but a shared image of an entire movement. On the stone steps, a few street musicians sat down and began to sing. The song was short, but each lyric, accompanied by soft guitar chords, caused the crowd to stop and listen. In the lyrics, Amara's hair was mentioned as a symbol of pride, of resistance, of a reminder that the path to justice always needs light. The candles flickered in the breeze, but did not go out, just like the crowd's faith, wavering but firmly held. At the center of the square, a giant banner was stretched out, showing a clear image of Amara's face with neatly braided hair. Below it, a handwritten message, scrawled but powerful: her hair, her voice. Everyone who passed by stopped to place a candle beneath the photo, as if offering a promise that her memory would never fade. The mood of remembrance turned into the strength of unity, as every chant, every gaze, every candle joined into a shared message: justice must be defended with truth and courage. The scene at the square that night did not resemble an ordinary protest. It carried the essence of a sacred ceremony, where pain transformed into collective energy. The chants of Amara echoed endlessly, mixed with singing, crying, and applause, forming an emotional symphony. Within the sea of people, the swaying fake braids and glowing candles came together to affirm that Amara was no longer just an individual victim, but a symbol of faith and resilience. And in that shimmering moment, everyone understood that her story would not end with a courtroom verdict, but would continue to live on in every heart lit by candlelight that night. As light fully descended, the candles kept glowing across the square, and amid the dense crowd, a group of young people carrying spray paint cans approached the large wall beside the main building. They did not act in secret, but in full view, and with the support of hundreds watching. Bold strokes began to appear, large letters stretching across the gray surface, painted in stark white: her hair, her voice. The crowd fell silent for a moment, then erupted in applause and chants. The once cold wall became a declaration board, a place where all eyes focused to affirm that one act of humiliation could not silence the voice of an entire community. The shaky first lines were followed by painted details, small children's hands dipped in paint and pressed onto the wall, turning it into a collective mural. These marks were not for decoration, but to prove that Amara's story had become a shared voice beyond age, skin color, or status. Each name signed beneath the phrase "her hair, her voice" was a vow to keep this memory alive, to turn pain into a lasting movement. Cameras panned the scene, reporters captured the moment, and within hours, the wall appeared in headlines across international media, becoming an unmistakable symbol. In that moment, the pain was no longer confined to a cut braid, but had transformed into communal strength. The initial sobs were replaced by resolute chants, and the eyes that met no longer carried only sympathy, but also solidarity. Strangers now held hands, lifted the same slogan, and placed more candles at the base of the wall. A middle-aged woman hugged her daughter and whispered, "Remember, this is not just Amara's story, it's all of ours." The words, spoken softly amid the noise, settled deeply in many hearts, for they echoed what everyone had been thinking. The sound of the square gradually turned into a collective symphony, as the pounding drums, clapping hands, singing voices, and chants blended together. The entire space lit up with the energy of unity. Pain was no longer buried in silence, but ignited into a flame, illuminating every face and guiding every step forward. That communal strength was not confined to one night, but promised to spread to inspire generations to come. And as everyone looked up at the words, her hair, her voice glowing under the warm yellow lights, they understood that Amara's story had gone beyond a courtroom or a single verdict. It had become a shared memory, a force strong enough to demand change from society. That pain, once shared, was no longer the burden of a child, but a driving force for an entire community to move forward, affirming that justice can only exist when every voice is respected. One afternoon, in the large lecture hall of the law school, the usual academic atmosphere suddenly turned into a lively forum. Hundreds of students filled every seat, their eyes fixed on the lectern, where a large screen replayed footage from the trial. They no longer viewed this as an ordinary case, but as a landmark example illustrating the thin line between power and justice. A group of students stood up to speak, voices impassioned. The case of Amara shows a most blatant violation of human rights. It forces us to ask, is the legal system strong enough to protect the vulnerable? Applause broke out from several corners, followed by an ongoing stream of analysis and debate like an unstoppable current. Other students took turns presenting arguments, citing international human rights law, referencing constitutional texts, and comparing them with the court's approach. A young woman raised her hand, voice sharp. What's notable is that the evidence not only convicted Bradley but also exposed flaws in the internal disciplinary system. Without public pressure and a media storm, would the case ever have come to light? That question cast a brief silence over the hall before another wave of discussion resumed, proving the event had gone far beyond a verdict, becoming a vivid legal lesson for an entire generation. The professor listened quietly, his eyes shining with pride as he watched his students not merely recite laws, but pose fundamental questions. He stood, walked slowly to the center of the lecture hall, his voice calm but resonant. Justice begins when we refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. That sentence rang through the room like a wake-up call. Students took notes intently. Some looked up and nodded to each other, as if they had just found clarity on the path they were meant to pursue. The closing remark was more than a summary of the lesson. It was a call to action, a reminder that the practice of law demands not only knowledge, but the courage to speak up. On the large wall at the back of the hall, a photo of Amara had been hung as proof of what the professor had just said. Her short hair after the trial, her steady gaze had become a symbol of the lesson under discussion. Students paused to look at the photo, some smiling softly, others sighing quietly, but all understood that this story would stay with them, following them on their journeys to become lawyers, judges, or future advocates for justice. The class ended, but the atmosphere lingered. Groups of students gathered in the hallway, continuing to discuss with voices tinged by both outrage and resolve. What began as a painful incident had now become an educational milestone, planting in the hearts of a new generation the belief that justice is not an abstract concept but a concrete action, one that begins with the courage to speak up. And as the sun began to set outside the window, the lecture hall remained bright with that belief a belief sparked by Amara's pain, but one that would be carried forward through the actions of an entire new generation. At the end of the discussion, as sunlight streamed diagonally through the windows, every gaze turned toward the wall where a large photograph of Amara was displayed. In the photo, she wore a soft smile, her newly braided hair neatly parted into even sections, a stark contrast to the fragile wounded image that had once shaken the public. Her smile wasn't dazzling, but warm and resolute, a quiet confirmation that Amara had found her confidence again. Many students stared at the picture for a long time, some tilting their heads as if to memorize every detail, others quietly snapping a photo to keep. The image of Amara with her new hairstyle wasn't just a portrait, but a symbol of recovery, of how a victim can rise after being degraded. A student in the front row whispered to the person beside them, "That hair looks like a new beginning." The comment was soft, but it struck a chord because everyone understood the photo wasn't just for remembrance. It was a reminder that pain can be healed through unity and belief. The expressions in the room softened while tense, replaced by empathy and quiet determination. That photograph, along with the professor's earlier analysis, became the emotional anchor of the entire session, helping each student realize that justice doesn't only reside in the words of the law, but also in every smile, every act of quiet courage. The case of Amara, from the moment the video was released to the final verdict, had now gone far beyond the scope of a legal proceeding. It had been incorporated into the curriculum as a generational lesson studied by law students, professors, and scholars alike, as a definitive example of society's role in safeguarding human dignity. The discussions extended beyond legal analysis, branching into professional ethics, human rights, and systemic accountability. Another professor closed the session with a short but powerful remark. The photo of Amara, with her new hair, isn't just an ending. It's a reminder that we must keep acting. From that lecture hall, the story spread to academic forums, international conferences, and even became the subject of numerous research projects. Students saw it as a defining point for their generation, a generation forced to confront the question of justice head-on without room for compromise through silence. That lesson found its way into essays, group discussions, and even hallway conversation. When they referred to the case, they didn't just recount the painful details, but emphasized the outcome: a young girl had turned personal humiliation into collective strength. And in the eyes of these young students, the photo of Amara with her new hair continued to shine, serving as a reminder that every generation must learn how to speak up. The event was no longer confined to the past. It had become a guiding light, a lesson passed down so that those who would one day hold the scales of justice would understand that silence is never an option, and that even the smallest act can shape history. Amara's small house, once quiet, had suddenly become the center of attention as dozens of reporters gathered at the gate, cameras, microphones, and bright lights flooding the street. Marcus Reed, the father who had long maintained his privacy through federal trials, appeared publicly for the first time beside his daughter. He wore a simple suit, no judge's badge, standing calmly yet firmly on the front porch. His eyes held steady, carrying both a father's love and the strength of someone who holds the scales of justice. Amara stood close beside him, her small hand tightly holding his, her eyes still showing traces of exhaustion, but clearly she had found safety again in the embrace of her family. When the microphones turned toward him, Marcus Reed didn't deliver a long statement. He simply said in a calm, firm voice, "Justice is not for show, it's to protect every life." The words rang out, short but weighty, causing the crowd at the gate to fall silent for a moment before the sound of recording devices, keyboards, and cameras resumed in unison. His message wasn't about boasting a legal victory, but a reminder that justice must always center on people, especially the most vulnerable. It was also a declaration that protecting Amara was not just an act of fatherly love, but a judge's duty to society. The crowd outside the house quickly broke into applause. People gathered nearby nodded in agreement. Someone whispered, "He's not just Amara's father, he speaks for all of us." Television crews immediately broadcast the clip live, and within minutes, Marcus Reed's words became headline material spreading across social media alongside the image of him standing next to his daughter. His statement was shared as a profound message, simple yet powerful. Inside the house, the air settled after long days of tension. Amara sat beside her father, eyes resting on a family photo hanging on the wall, a gentle smile forming as if reclaiming a part of her stolen childhood. Marcus Reed placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze softening, but beneath it still burned a determined fire. He knew the trial was over, but the fight to uphold justice was far from done, and every word he spoke today would serve as a promise to society. Outside the door, people still waited, many holding candles, flowers, and even strands of symbolic braided yarn to show support. They hadn't come just to witness a judge speak, but to share the belief that justice is no longer an abstract concept. It starts in every home, with every person. And in that moment, Amara's small house became more than a family's refuge. It became a symbol of protection, a place where a father had turned love into a vow that justice must exist to shelter, not to decorate power. In that moment, as all eyes turned to the small front porch, Amara leaned in close to her father, her tiny hand gripping his as if clinging to the safest anchor in her life. Her face still carried traces of haunting days, but her eyes were different, not only filled with fear, but now shimmering with the light of newfound trust. The presence of Marcus Reed beside her made her feel less alone, and every gentle gesture from him served as a shield affirming that the pain she had endured was no longer meaningless. Behind the doorframe, cameras captured every movement, and the image of the girl nestled beside her father quickly became a moment that touched the hearts of millions. Newspapers ran the photo on their front pages the next morning. Under the soft yellow glow of the porch light, Amara was seen holding her father's hand, eyes looking out toward the crowd of reporters, no longer avoiding their gaze. A simple caption read, "Trust restored," but the weight of the image went far beyond any words. The photo appeared everywhere, from news broadcasts and social media posts to walls in classrooms, offices, and community centers. People looked to it and saw the resilience of a child, the protection of a father, and the power of justice fulfilled. Soon, the image became a national symbol. Street artists painted it on city walls, transforming it into a piece of public art. Marches for social justice featured posters of Amara leaning on her father, accompanied by slogans affirming that human dignity is non-negotiable. In lecture halls, students discussed the meaning of that moment as proof that justice isn't only delivered through verdicts, but also through the feeling of being protected and believed. The image crossed borders, featured by international news agencies as a symbol of the fight against abuse of power and discrimination. One journalist wrote, "The girl's eyes no longer tremble, they reflect trust. And in that gaze, we understand why justice must exist." The brief sentence was shared by thousands, turning Amara into a face not only of pain, but of strength and recovery. In front of the small house, people continued to gather, lighting candles, laying flowers, and quietly standing before a large print of the photo hung at the gate. They whispered to one another that this was not just the story of a single family, but a message to society that every child deserves safety and respect. And in the moment Amara leaned against her father, her eyes regaining their trust, the image rose above everything else, becoming a legacy of spirit, a symbol remembered by an entire nation. After the verdict against Bradley was announced, the shockwave didn't stop at the public. It surged straight into the police force itself. At headquarters, an emergency meeting was called with a series of new documents introduced to amend operational protocols. On the large screen in the center of the meeting room, a bold statement appeared. All acts that insult a person's appearance, dignity, or culture are strictly prohibited. The room stirred with murmurs as officers exchanged surprised glances, many of them never having considered that something as seemingly minor as a mocking comment or demeaning gesture could become the turning point for reforming an entire system. For a moment, silence hung in the air, then broke into a wave of hushed conversation filled with unease but also a hint of hope. A young officer sitting mid-row after carefully reading the text exclaimed in disbelief, "We've never had anything like this before." His voice echoed, prompting nods across the room. For those newly joined to the force, the regulation felt like a compass to steer them clear of the missteps that had nearly brought down the entire institution. But for those long accustomed to rigid behaviors, it was a warning that the era of excusing disrespect was over. On many faces, change registered in their eyes, some wary, some supportive, others confused together, painting a picture of a force in flux, but also facing the possibility of a new direction. During the meeting, a senior commander slowly rose to speak, his tone calm, but weighted. "Every one of our actions is under public scrutiny. Don't forget the badge on your chest does not grant permission to trample on someone's dignity." His words rang clear, each one striking like a hammer against the tiled floor, causing many in the audience to lower their heads. Cases that were once brushed aside had become glaring examples of disciplinary failure, and the new regulations stood as an acknowledgement that the institution must evolve. At the same time, the department's internal networks simultaneously published the new policy accompanied by a message emphasizing each officer's individual responsibility. Those who had stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing were now forced to confront the reality that silence was complicity. Throughout various departments, quiet conversations unfolded. Some older officers sat in deep thought, while younger ones spoke with enthusiasm about hopes for a fairer working environment. Amara's story was repeated as a reminder that even one wrongful act could shatter the trust the entire force had worked hard to build. And so, within the heart of the institution, once shaken by scandal, the seeds of reform began to take root not only in official policy, but in the minds of those who wore the uniform. The verdict against Bradley had not just ended a career, it had opened a reckoning demanding that every officer look inward and outward with renewed accountability. The introduction of the new regulation was not an end, but the beginning of a reform era. It wasn't just a legal measure, but a public commitment that the police force would no longer tolerate any act that demeans human dignity. In the surprised and contemplative eyes of the officers, there was also a glimmer of hope that from such pain, a new system of protection would emerge, ensuring that tragedies like Amara's would never happen again. And in that meeting room, the new regulation marked a turning point where human dignity was for the first time placed on equal footing with discipline and authority. In the corridors of the headquarters, the atmosphere was different from previous days. Not the usual noise, thoughtful, quiet conversations. Officers passed by a newly posted sign on the wall, clearly stating the new rules. Everyone stopped to read, then silently nodded. An old inspector said to a younger colleague, "This is a turning point, and it's bitter that it had to start from something so painful." The words struck a chord because everyone understood that it took such a profound loss to shake the entire system. Amara's story had become an unerasable scar, a reminder that every reform comes at the cost of blood and tears, but also the beginning of a new chapter. The shift became more visible in every meeting, every report, even in the way officers looked at one another. Many who had grown used to staying silent now began to ask questions about the limits of power, about their responsibilities to the public. A young female officer shared during a discussion, "If it weren't for Amara, maybe we'd still think that small things like an insulting comment didn't matter." But the truth is, those are exactly the things that destroy the trust of an entire community. Her words were met with applause from colleagues, proof that reform had moved beyond paperwork and was taking root in the mindset of those who held power. The change was also reflected in new training programs. In class, instructors no longer focused solely on tactical procedures but on dignity, culture, and behavior. Trainees were required to study Amara's case as a core lesson to understand how even one seemingly minor act could lead to serious consequences. Some seasoned officers were initially reluctant, but gradually even they had to admit that this change was necessary if trust was ever to be restored. The clearest sign of change from within the system came in how leadership handled complaints. Where reports were once easily dismissed, now each letter was read carefully, each concern investigated. Citizens began to notice the difference they felt heard, no longer ignored behind closed file cabinets. The change, though slow, spread like an undercurrent, slowly transforming a force once seen as a symbol of fear into a place where trust could begin to take root. This reform process did not unfold easily, but the fact that it began with a painful incident made its message all the more powerful. Amara's story was mentioned in every training session, becoming a milestone to measure the system's progress. The words on the posters were no longer just slogans, but commitments tied to every action. And from within, as people inside the system began to question one another, signs of change became clear, affirming that justice does not come solely from external pressure, but must also be built from the internal strength of the very system that once caused harm. One clear morning, as the first sunlight spread across the busy streets, people looked up and stopped in their tracks at the sight of a massive mural, newly completed, on the wall of an old building in the city center. Against the gray brick background, Amara's image appeared vividly, her hair braided in full long strands falling over her shoulders, her bright eyes gazing into the distance as if looking toward a new future. The mural's vibrant colors stood out against the surroundings, making passers-by pause, not just to admire, but to quietly absorb the message from a child who once endured injustice. The painting was not just art, but a story told in color proof that from pain strength had been ignited to illuminate a community. Just below the mural, bold white letters read, "Justice needs no badge." The slogan was no longer unfamiliar, having once echoed through the streets, printed on protest signs and shouted in marches. Now it sat permanently beneath Amara's image, a declaration that justice does not belong to a badge or to imposed authority, but to truth and courage. Those who stopped to read the words nodded quietly, some with tears in their eyes, others raising their phones to capture and share the image that had come to symbolize a turning point in history. Crowds grew by the hour, turning the wall into a new gathering place. Children stood, pointing at Amara's braided hair, their eyes wide with a sense of pride. Adults lit small candles at the base of the wall, some placing flowers beside them, creating a scene both simple and sacred. Other street artists began adding patterns and designs around the edges, transforming the wall into a collective work. The once familiar, worn-out neighborhood now came alive with color conversation and the shared belief that through one child, justice had found its voice. The mural quickly appeared in newspapers, on television, and across social media, becoming a destination for visitors from near and far. Students, teachers, and activists came to stand before it, explaining to their peers, students, and colleagues that this was not just a painting but a living lesson. Buses passing by often lingered so riders could get a better look, and many used the image as the backdrop for telling their own stories. The image of Amara with her braided hair paired with the words beneath it soon became a symbol for the entire city, then the nation, and eventually the world. In the evenings, when the streetlights flicker on the mural, glows softly a reminder that no matter how dark the night becomes, there is still light to guide justice. People passing by often pause for a moment, take a deep breath, and continue on their way, carrying with them a quiet sense of renewed strength. And from that point on, Amara's story, from personal pain to a symbol of community, found its closure on the city wall, leaving behind a lesson that would never fade. justice does not need a badge to exist. It lives in the hearts of those brave enough to stand for the truth. The once crowded street has now become a meeting point of collective memory, where Amara's mural with her fully braided hair shines brightly in the heart of the city. Passers-by stop, look up for a long time, then take out their phones to capture the image. Some keep it for themselves, others share it online with heartfelt captions. Children hold their parents' hands, point to Amara's long hair in the mural, and ask why the whole city knows about a little girl. Adults respond with simple stories explaining that this is a symbol of justice, a testament to courage, and that from the pain of one child, an entire society was awakened. Those conversations ripple through the crowd, spreading from one person to the next, turning the street into a space filled with stories that are never truly quiet. At the base of the wall, people gather in small groups, taking photos and talking. Some recall witnessing the trial, others share memories of the night the square was lit with candles and chants. These emotional stories deepen the mural's meaning, turning it from a piece of public art into a living history. The stories about Amara are told again and again, but instead of fading, they grow stronger because each retelling reinforces a collective belief in justice. The wall is no longer a cold brick surface, but a keeper of truth where each person can find a reflection of their own hope. The city gradually came to see the mural as a source of strength. Visitors from other places come to take pictures to see for themselves the symbol they had only known through headlines. Teachers bring their students, point to the words below, and explain that justice does not come from imposed power, from the people from truth cannot be silenced. Elderly people stand for a long time leaning on their canes, looking up with a gentle smile as if letting go of a burden they had carried all their lives. Amara's image is etched into the city's collective memory, not just because of the pain she endured, but because she became the spark for change. And so the journey came to a close with a lesson the entire society agreed upon. Justice does not lie in a badge, but in courage and truth. People no longer remember Bradley as the officer who abused her power, but remember Amara as the child who turned pain into strength and forced an entire system to change. Her story is retold in schools and lectures and community meetings as a compass pointing to the truth that staying silent in the face of injustice is to enable it, while speaking up with courage opens the path for justice. Under the sunset glow, when the mural on the city wall shines in soft gold, the words "Justice needs no badge" appear once more in proud defiance. People still stop, still take photos, still tell each other the story as if it had happened just yesterday. And in every heartbeat of the community, that lesson continues to echo, reminding everyone that truth and courage are the true foundations of justice, while a badge holds meaning only when it stands with the people. The story ends in the gaze of thousands who had followed it from the very beginning, from the moment Amara was humiliated to the time her mural became a shared symbol. What happened is no longer seen as an isolated incident, but as a journey that forced an entire community to confront the truth about how power can be misused, and more importantly, how people can unite to reclaim justice. From tears in an interrogation room to chants in the square, every moment has been woven into an epic of trials where pain was transformed into strength. Amara, the girl who once trembled, clutching her severed braid, now stands tall as living proof that dignity can be wounded but never erased. Her resolve, along with the unwavering presence of Marcus Reed, became the anchor for millions to believe that justice still exists. The evidence was revealed, the truth was not buried, and the final verdict against Bradley was not just personal punishment, but a declaration that acts of humiliation will never be tolerated. The image of Amara, with her new braids eyes full of trust as she stands beside her father, is etched into society's memory as a lasting reminder. Throughout this journey, it became clear that strength does not lie in those who hold power, but in the collective voice and individual courage of the people. One hidden video was enough to awaken an entire society, and from it, thousands of voices rose together in a wave that swept away every false justification. It is here that people realized justice only holds true power when it is guarded and upheld by the public, that the voice of the community is the strongest barrier against abuse. The reforms within the police force also stemmed from this incident, as the institution was forced to admit its own shortcomings and implement new regulations to protect human dignity. Though delayed, it was still a significant step forward because it proved that change can begin from pain. When young officers look at the newly issued directives, they don't just see a dry set of rules, but they see Amara's image and hear the chants from the streets reminding them that their duty is not only to maintain order, but to protect dignity. The massive mural on the city wall with Amara's braided hair and the words "Justice needs no badge" became the ultimate symbol of this journey. People stop, take photos, tell each other the story, and with every retelling, the memory is carved deeper. As that image spread, it transcended the borders of a city, of a nation, and became a global message. Justice is not measured by the power one holds, but by how people treat each other with respect. The greatest lesson from this journey is that justice does not exist on its own. It is forged from the courage of those who dare to rise. Amara chose not to stay silent, Marcus Reed did not hide his daughter's pain, and the community did not turn away from injustice. It was that collective response that created a powerful voice strong enough to force a system to change. That lesson belongs to all of us. That truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface, and when it is brought into the light, it opens the door to hope. When the story ends, people do not only remember the pain of a little girl, but also the strength that rose from it. Justice does not live in a badge. Justice lives in the heart and courage of those who dare to say enough. And from those simple reminders, the next generation will walk forward carrying the belief that truth and dignity are always worth defending at any cost.